Welcome here to Earth Week Online, which is coming to you live from Treaty 1 territory, which is also the homeland of the Métis Nation. I'd like to acknowledge that our water that we're using to wash our hands is coming to us from Treaty 3, and this electricity that we're using to access this beautiful recording and this wonderful information today is coming from Treaty 5 and beyond. So I just want to acknowledge that and really think about what that means. As I said, this is brought to you by the Climate Action Team, which is made up of 5 organizations. They are Climate Change Connection, who you're going to hear from today, Wilderness Committee, who you heard from on Monday, Green Action Center, which was yesterday, and then we've got the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives and Manitoba Energy Justice Coalition, with whom I volunteer. So you're all watching this on Facebook Live, which is great. And this is exactly where we want you to put your questions. So at any point during the conversation, if you have any questions at all, please write them in the chat and we'll make sure that we get them asked to Curt. Which brings me to the fact that this is happening all week. So we've already had 2, this is number 3, and then we've got 2 more to go. So tomorrow we're gonna learn a little bit more about what deep decarbonization means. How can we make it so that our economy is not so fossil fuel centric anymore? All right, so without further ado, oh wait, and one more thing. On Friday, we're still gonna be meeting here at noon for a discussion, but just a reminder that we're also doing the climate strike that day. So make sure you tune into your radio, CKUW or to UMFM at 10:15. And it's also going to be streaming on Spotify and other places, so be sure to check it out online. Make some noise for the climate. And we're going to go outside and make sure that we fill our city with beautiful sounds of both outrage and demands for hope and change and resilience. All right, so to talk about resilience, we have Mr. Curt Hall here today. Curt's one of the hardest working people in Manitoba on the issue of climate, so thank you for all his work and knowledge. And I'm going to turn it over to him. Thanks, Curt.
Thanks, Laura. Thanks very much for introducing me, and thanks for hosting this this morning's presentation, this event as part of Earth Week. This is Earth Week, the 50th anniversary of Earth Week, and I'm going to share with you some of my concerns, and hopefully they're concerns that at least you have some idea about, but maybe we'll deepen our understanding and maybe move ourselves towards solutions. So that's what we're going to do here today. So got a bit of a presentation to share with you here, and we're going to, in this presentation, talk a little bit about the impacts of climate change, but I'm going to focus on solution. And as Laura mentioned, please put your questions in the comments, and I'll see if we can provide some answers for you. So I work for Climate Change Connection, and this is a photo of my colleague Susan. And Climate Change Connection is a nonprofit organization that's been active since 2002. And we focus on 2 things. We focus on educating Manitobans about climate change and on solutions. Susan happens to be very adept and very well connected with teachers and students and young people. And I'm involved with a lot of different groups, different sectors with respect to solution. Now, today I'm going to share with you a few points, a few ideas about the consequences of climate change from a local perspective, from a Manitoba perspective. I'm not going to go too deeply into that, just sort of remind you of these local consequences, both apparent and maybe not so apparent. So we'll start with just a brief overview of some of the impacts of climate change here in Manitoba. Manitoba is a large province that goes a fair ways north and into the permafrost. And there are structures that are built on the permafrost which are now in peril. The permafrost, the southernmost line of the permafrost is moving north continuously, and anything built on the permafrost is losing its substrate, losing that basis. And this is a photograph of the Churchill rail line, and it's not much wonder that the train to Churchill sometimes doesn't go much faster than walking speed. And another important transportation network in the north is the network of winter roads that we have. And these winter roads have to be built every year. And it depends on a good solid freeze situation. And what's been happening lately is that the period where we've got reliable winter road is getting shorter and less dependable. And so that's putting the communities that depend on these winter roads for their supply of fuel and food and building supplies, that kind of thing, essential goods, that is not as dependable as it used to be. And there's likely a year in the not too distant future when we won't have winter roads. And of course, here in the South and all over, when people think about climate change, the thing that's most apparent is severe weather events and the unpredictability of weather. When I talk to farmers, they talk about wacky weather and how things are just crazy. That what used to be is no longer the case. We've got a new normal, which actually isn't that normal. And flooding Manitobans are no stranger to flooding. And when we have either a spring melt flood, this year I think we're going to be pretty lucky, but in years past that hasn't been the case. 2011 was a famous spring flooding year where the folks in Lake St. Martin First Nation and Little Saskatchewan First Nation had to be evacuated and displaced it turns out, for many years. So they were climate refugees. And the floods, when they occur, pick up nutrients from wherever they flood, and they pick up, diesel fuel from farmyards and fertilizer, and go into feedlots and pick up manure and everything else. And all those nutrients land up in our lakes, and is one of the drivers of the eutrophication of Lake Winnipeg, a big concern for Manitobans. And it's getting worse the more floods that we have. And conversely, we have the prospect of drought. We have not had drought for a while now. We've had a number of years in sequence that have been wetter than we usually have, but we're no stranger to droughts, and they will come again. And climate change tends to amplify things. Wet years get really wet, dry years get really dry. And in this period from 1999 to 2004, we had a drought that was reported to be one of the worst in 100 years in the Canadian prairies. Most of that was further west than us in Saskatchewan and Alberta, but it was very severe here as well. And when we have these drought conditions, that wonderful electricity that Laura mentioned in her intro is driven by the water. So when we have a dry year, hydro doesn't have as much water for the dams. And it will have a financial consequence for hydro and for Manitobans when we don't have that water, and when we can't enjoy that clean hydroelectric power. And when things get dry, they burn. And for much of the province is covered in boreal forest. And when we do have a fire, the communities that are near the forest need to be evacuated, sometimes at an hour's notice, or very, very quick notice, and they get, in this case, there's an airlift out from a remote community. So these kinds of things are happening more frequently, more severely. Now, I didn't go into the other global impacts of climate change. I focused on the local Manitoba consequences of climate change, but they do have follow-on consequences, and we're going to get to that in a few minutes. But when it comes to solution, what we're talking about is reducing our dependence on fossil fuels and reducing the amount of pollution and climate change generating pollution that we put into the atmosphere. And how are we doing? Well, globally, we had a pivotal year in 2015. In 2015, during the Paris Climate Summit, all of the countries of the world came to an agreement and declared that the future is fossil fuel free, that they agreed to work together to achieve net zero greenhouse gas emissions. That was pivotal. That means that the time frame's another question, but they all agreed to work on that, and that was a watershed moment. They did ultimately agree, and the United States is still in that agreement, even though they've signaled that they want to walk away from it. And so we brought that home. And a year later, that was December 2015. December 2016, the Canadian government announced their Pan-Canadian Framework on Clean Growth and Climate Change. And so they have announced a plan to address climate change. And then a year after that, the provincial government in Manitoba announced their Made in Manitoba Climate and Green Plan. That's 2017. And then a year after that, 2018, the city of Winnipeg and the Winnipeg City Council proclaimed the climate action plan for Winnipeg. So now we've got plans at all of the Canadian levels and an announcement of a direction globally. So how have we done? Well, here in Manitoba, this is the graph of the emissions, the annual emissions that Manitobans generate, that our activities, human activity generates here in the province. As you can see, the most recent data we've got is 2018. It was just released last week, actually. And we've hit a record, but a record in the wrong direction. So far, we have not been headed in the direction that we want to go. Instead, things were, if anything, according to the most recent data, getting worse. So what does that mean? What kind of time frame do we really have to deal with this? This document that you see here, this is the IPCC 1.5 report. And when it came out at Thanksgiving in 2018, it really had a profound impact on a lot of us that read it and spent the time to understand it. Because it put a time frame and a scale of action, of solution action in front of us. And basically, this is the outline of that document, the 1.5 report, and why it's so meaningful. It says basically, if you look at that red curve on this graph, it shows the way that the global average annual temperatures have been increasing over the last half decade or so. And if we project it into the future, we're going to get much warmer, and therefore the consequences are going to get much more severe. So what we want to do is have global annual average temperatures meet into that gray area there. So bending the curve, and this is flattening the climate curve. This is what we want to do, is we want to flatten that curve and get us into a steady state somewhere around, ideally around 1.5 degrees warmer than what it was before industrialization in the 19th century. So, and if we can do that, we can avoid the worst consequences of climate change in a warming climate that results in profound impacts that will be felt globally. So in order to do that, in order to flatten in order to flatten the climate curve, what do we need to do? And that's the next graph that they showed in that IPCC report, in the IPCC Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. So this is the curve that really shocked us, those of us that read it and understood it. And what it shows is that global annual emissions needs to really start to fall no later than, we should be really dropping them dramatically as of now, 2020. And they should be falling continuously until they reach zero around about 2050. We should be producing no human anthropogenic greenhouse gases, no human created greenhouse gases by the middle of this century. So then this curve actually has us extracting greenhouse gases from the atmosphere, carbon from the atmosphere, in the last half of the century, with things like reforestation and mechanisms that we don't even know of yet. And that's really profound. The amount of work involved in this is really significant, and that's what we have to concern ourselves with, and that's what we have to do. And there's the alarm that was created a while ago and has been amping up, has been really amplified, really driven by, in the most recent couple of years, by this young woman here. This is Greta Thunberg. And she started her climate strike only in August 2018. It seems like it's been for a while because it's been profoundly important and widespread. And she's got us off of that complacency and started to really move us. And here in Manitoba, last September, 12 to 15,000 people came out and expressed their concern about it, about climate change. So that we're concerned. What are we going to do? Before I go there, I just want to add one little story about connections. That's why I use these dominoes, connections. That there are consequences of climate change beyond the fires and the floods and the droughts. And I'm going to talk about Syria. Syria, where is Syria? Syria's in the Middle East. We've heard a lot about Syria, but they've got coastal access to the Mediterranean, and they're bordering on a country like Iraq. And Iraq has had wars going on for the last couple of decades, and those folks didn't necessarily want to stay in the war zone. Some of them moved into Syria, and had to be absorbed by Syria and caused a certain amount of disruption and change that had to occur in Syria. But then in 2006, there was a severe drought that occurred in Syria. And it wasn't just a bad crop here. This is a prolonged, deep drought that resulted in 60% of their land becoming desert, no longer able to be cultivated. And in addition, 80% of their cattle died. So now you've got a situation where you've got this pressure from the people coming in from the war zone, added to it the drought that occurs over the 5-year period, and now people are displaced within the country and moving often into the cities because they can no longer provide for themselves on farms. And what results is civil war. And that civil war results in people not even being able to live in the cities. And so many of them leave Syria and move elsewhere, Turkey, Lebanon, and to Europe. And when they move into Europe, there was a backlash, this pushback from Europeans, including this fellow. And in the UK, in the debate over Brexit, this image was used to drive fear into people's minds and to say, we have to get out of the European Union in order to prevent this cascade of refugees coming our way. So this is what I'm saying. The connections, who would have known in 2006 when the rains didn't come in Syria, that it would have an impact on on the UK leaving the European Union. This is what we have to anticipate, is follow-on consequences of climate change, bringing about conflict, bringing about disturbances that we can't really predict necessarily. But when people can't feed themselves, they're going to move. And when they move, that's when pressures mount. And here in Manitoba, I'm not saying that we're going to have we're not going to have a war in Manitoba, but we will see economic consequences that we can't necessarily anticipate. And that's what we're seeing with the COVID crisis. We're seeing economic consequences of a disturbance that we couldn't really anticipate, or at least we didn't really anticipate well. And in order to prepare ourselves from these kinds of disturbances, what I'm proposing is that we need to build our resilience here. And what that means is, when I say resilience, that means we need to be able to have the ability to meet our basic needs ourselves and without fossil fuels. And what are those basic needs? Well, the basic needs really are food, shelter, and transportation. So the challenge that we have is that we need to be able to feed ourselves without synthetic fertilizers and without diesel for the machinery. We need to be able to heat all of our buildings without natural gas, all of our buildings old and new. And we need to be able to move all goods and people without gasoline and diesel. That's the challenge that we have to look at. You know, the emissions curve will take care of itself to a large extent if we focus on meeting our essential needs and doing these things. So we'll combat climate change at the same time as we build our ability to be resilient to disturbances that are coming our way that we're not necessarily predictable. Okay, how do we do this? This is a big challenge. Well, there are some things that are going on and need to be amplified, things that are going on here in Manitoba. Local food, really it amounts to local food. Local gardening, either in your yard or in your community. And there's some wonderful examples. Sustainable South Osborne here in Winnipeg has gardens that they have created in the last few years right on Churchill Drive, right next to the river, where they've taken what used to be just grass and turned it into community gardens and community orchards. And this is local neighborhood people working together to feed each other and feed themselves. So they're building neighborhood at the same time as they're building local food resilience and food security. There's also a need to connect producers more closely with consumers. And we're seeing that actually with the COVID crisis, with the increase in the amount of customer-supported agriculture, CSA. And that kind of thing needs to be enhanced. And connecting small farms, small producers, the food that we put on the table needs to come from Manitoba. More and more. That's what we're talking about. And how that food is grown and needs to be done differently than it was done in the past. It's not just traditional industrial agriculture, but some new practices that are being employed now, and more people are getting to know it. One of the most interesting ones here is regenerative agriculture that includes a different way of raising livestock, but using livestock for putting nutrients back into the soil. And that's an important aspect, is taking the nutrients and closing the cycle, more like a traditional First Nations and Indigenous world view of nothing should be wasted. Instead, we should make waste into inputs. And that includes household composting, like we learned about yesterday from the Green Action Center, and at other scales, agricultural level composting, that has been done to a certain extent here in Manitoba, needs to be done more, and industrial composting. This is a photograph of the composter at the Forks, and part of their Target Zero operation, taking the food scraps from the restaurants at the Forks. Shelter. There's two aspects of shelter that we have to really get serious on. The first one has to do with the building envelope, the insulation and the vapor barrier around the building. And there are ways to design and construct buildings that we don't do very much here in Manitoba. We need to do a lot more of. And there's a discipline called passive house. The photograph that you see here is the first certified passive house in Manitoba. It's up near Gimli, and the fellow that you see, Eric Bjornson and his Sundial Performance, were the builders of that home. And that home is built to a passive house standard. And in the middle of winter, actually, they had to improve the drapes they've got, because they were actually gaining too much heat, even on a cloudy day from the sun. A passive house will only require about 20% of the heating energy that a typical code-built house requires. So that's an important aspect right there. Make our buildings more efficient. But we do need to heat some buildings, especially institutional buildings, and we can change how that is done, make it much more efficient. For example, the air that comes into our ventilation systems, even these really highly sealed buildings, need to have positive ventilation to air exchange so that the air inside is healthy. Well, why bring in 40 below air, 30 below air? Why not preheat that air with the warmth from the sun? And that's what a solar wall does. The air comes up, in this case, from the bottom. It's drawn up behind these black walls, and then it's pre-warmed by quite a bit, even in a very cold day, before it comes into the ventilation system. Solar walls are very important here. Changing the energy source, change the fuel for the heat. And primarily we're talking about biomass, passive solar for the solar walls, and then biomass and electricity for the heating fuel. Biomass is appropriate in certain places. For example, this example here in Providence College in southeastern Manitoba is using largely agricultural waste, straw, and also some wood from a nearby furniture manufacturer. So in this case, the campus for Providence College the campus is heated by the heat generated by the burning of that straw and wood fiber. And what you see there is it heats up a boiler, heats the water and glycol, and then that water glycol is pumped through those pipes to heat the buildings in the campus. And the heat could come from agricultural waste like that, or in northern remote communities. This is an example in the Northern First Nation of Northlands-Dennisy-Fluna First Nation in Lake Lac Rocher, a project that I've got some connection to. And the wood that you see there was not live harvested. That wood was killed by forest fire. So what they're burning in the heat plant, which is the white building in the background, what they're burning is wood that was previously killed by forest fire, but still has a core of solid wood remaining that was not burnt up in the fire. And that's a key source of heat now for a considerable amount of heat required for that community. But I mentioned before in the Providence example that heated water glycol needs to be pumped around the campus in what's called a district heating solution. And this kind of thing used to be done in downtown Winnipeg. Back in, I think in the 50s, it was still in operation, where a lot of the big bank buildings downtown were all connected together with a hot water system that was heated by a plant near the foot of the Disraeli Bridge. We need to do more of that, and with a different heat source than coal, which is what they used in the 50s. But this is an important aspect of the solution, district heating. And geothermal, when Manitobans are familiar with geothermal, using the latent heat and heating and cooling capacity of the ground for a lot of our heat requirements. And what I'm proposing is a district heating solution for the distribution of that geothermal. And rather than individual homeowners having to go through all of the expense of drilling deep wells and things like that, why not have it more of a neighborhood and a utility solution of providing geothermal for homes and commercial buildings? And another, that's ground sourced heat pumps. That's the one that we're most familiar with. But there's also lake-based or river-based geothermal and this is an example again in Lac Rocher, Northlands Dennisy-Fluna, where they've got these coils were taken out into the lake and submerged at least 4 meters under the surface of the water, so that they're always in liquid water, even in the middle of the winter, and heat can be extracted from that. And the last of the three main heat pump ideas is air source heat pumps. So anybody who has electric heat can dramatically improve the efficiency of that heat by a heat pump, such as these in the photo here. And the last subject is transportation. And so we need to move all goods and people without gasoline or diesel. Okay, how do we do that? Well, first of all, why move people at all? I mean, we're getting a lot of experience with that right now. Is we're still able to connect people together and people to be able to share ideas, and a lot of shopping is being done online, and it's being done without moving. And so take a look at how much how much goods and people do we really need to move, and how much of it can be done virtually. That's a big part of the solution. And when we do move, how do we do it? Let's choose to walk first and ride bicycles next, or the other way around, whichever is your preference. But why use a vehicle at all? And here in Winnipeg, there's been some significant improvements made in the last decade or so in the amount of active transportation infrastructure that's available. And Bike Winnipeg and Bike Week have been big drivers of raising awareness of that and getting that change to happen. Why own a car at all? I don't own a car. I use the Peg City Car Co-op when I want to do some running around that's not easily done by a bus or by bike. I can book a car online and use it and pay for just the time that I use and the number of kilometers that I go. And I do take transit, and we need to do that more when we can get closer together again. And when we do use transit, or transit should be electric. The bus that you see in this photograph was manufactured in Manitoba. It was right here in Winnipeg at New Flyer. We're selling them all over North America, and yet we don't have any electric buses here in the city. This bus here is no longer in operation. It was part of a trial a few years ago. But electrification is really a main thing for the solution. And the Manitoba Electric Vehicle Association has been a leader in raising awareness for this in Manitoba. And we're starting to see more level 2 charging stations throughout the province. Everybody has, most of us have got not an official level 1, but we've got what would be considered a level 1 charging capability when we've got block heater plug outlets. And the level 2 gives us a little faster charge, and then level 3 is the Tesla mega chargers that now has a network right across the country. Other parts of the country are way ahead of us when it comes to charging networks. Quebec is head and shoulders above where we are, and hopefully we can really put our minds to catching up. And this is an important graph. This is this graph here is really important. What it shows is that the cost of production of a fossil fuel powered powertrain, that means just the engine and the axles and the wheels, is going up basically according to inflation. But the cost of a similar capability electric drivetrain, and I'm talking about 5 kilometers range, so that's about the range you'll get out of a tank full of gasoline, is that cost of those vehicles is coming down dramatically. And when this chart was developed in 2017, the prediction was that those two cost curves should cross somewhere around 2023, 2024. Indications are now that we may even beat that. The two cost curves may, no guarantees, but there's a lot of effort being put, and most of the auto manufacturers, virtually all of the auto manufacturers, are coming out with electric offerings and increasing the number of electric offerings and really learning how to build these things, how to design them, how to produce them cost effectively. And it's not just cars, it's also other vehicles. And the Tesla Semi came out a year or so ago. It's just a matter of getting it into production. But in terms of its capability and its profitability from a goods movement perspective, it's there. The numbers work. This vehicle will be profitable and very reliable and capable in terms of its pulling capability to move goods. And it doesn't stop there. There's other aspects of electrification and vehicle changes that are happening. At the same time, we've got autonomous vehicles. So vehicles of the future may look considerably different than they do now, just by virtue of things like becoming autonomous and becoming electric. And it doesn't stop there. It goes into other vehicles. Like this is a prototype self-driving tractor from John Deere. So they're experimenting with all kinds of new solutions, and that's where the future lies. Is really, we just can't rely on our old way of thinking. We have to be inventive. We've got to be thinking outside the box, because that's where the solution lies. And the last idea that I'm going to put towards you is Dr. Barry Prentice from the University of Manitoba has been championing airships. These are balloons. They're not necessarily lighter than air, but they're largely light. They're buoyant aircraft, buoyed up by helium or hydrogen. And there's a lot. When I started this presentation, I talked about the peril or the uncertainty of the winter roads in the north. Well, airships is the solution. When we don't have a year, when we don't have winter roads, we need to have something like airships in order to provide get provisions to these communities that otherwise don't have any connection to the south. So there we are. That's my presentation, and now I'm available for any questions or comments that may be coming online from the audience. Hi, Laura.
Kurt, thank you. Hi, Kurt. Thank you so much for that presentation. There was so much information and some things that are in my brain, but now have been described as they're no longer questions for me. So thank you for that. I really appreciate anybody who can bring down the science to an understandable way of moving through and accepting it. So just a few questions here. So what role do synthetic fertilizers play in the agricultural loop?
Sorry, what was that again?
What is the role do synthetic fertilizers play with regards to agriculture?
Yeah, synthetic fertilizers. When I say synthetic fertilizers, I'm largely thinking of anhydrous ammonia, anhydrous fertilizers, which provides nitrogen for crops. And there's no doubt that these fertilizers have had a significant impact on the yield that we've been getting out of our crops. But the problem is that the production of those anhydrous fertilizers involves a lot of natural gas. Because it requires the nitrogen and hydrogen in order to be produced, and it gets that from natural gas. They take the natural gas and they actually break it apart to pull the hydrogen off of it. But they also use the natural gas for heat, because there's heat required in the process. But there are alternatives. If you're just talking about a source of that kind of fertilizer, it can be done by electrolysis using our hydroelectricity, and also like the plant that produces the fertilizer is in Brandon, the Coke fertilizer plant. They're also close to the landfill in Brandon, and they're now capturing methane at the landfill, and there could be a source of energy for a heat source from the landfill, and potentially a source of hydrogen from cracking or from electrolysis using electricity. Does that answer the question, you think?
Yeah, I think that helps. It shows that there are some alternatives out there, and that we're starting to move in that direction.
Yeah, and that's the other thing.
Right now
Sorry, I was just focused on the anhydrous, but actually, there's really the fertilizer. There's sources of fertilizer beyond that kind of fertilizer, and that's the table scraps, and that's all of the food that isn't eaten that is nutrients, and we need to really think about those scraps as something of value, and have systems that captures those nutrients and brings them back and puts them back into the food system as an input. I mentioned briefly about really how that circular worldview that Indigenous people have known for generations, if not forever, and they understand that there's no such thing as linear growth forever, that things work in a circle, and that's the way that we should be thinking of the future, changing so that things are circular. We have circular economy, so that we have circular nutrient cycles, so that that nutrients go back into the food system as much as possible, so that we have composting and collection of any nutrients instead of just dissipating them ultimately into the lakes in many cases.
Great. Yeah. Can you expand just a little bit more on what you mean by circular economy for those who don't know, just so that they don't rely on Mufasa's description from The Lion King?
Yeah, the circle of life, right? The circular economy is where you that there, as much as possible, there is no waste. That you minimize the amount of extraction from the earth, but instead, once it's extracted, it's then used over and over and over again. So a good example actually is in the automotive industry, that there's a good deal of recycling of the metals. The biggest recycling element of vehicles are the metals that are used in cars, and there's some pretty significant figures on the amount of the metals that wind up staying in the vehicle production system. And we need to do more of that with other things. We have to consider the full life cycle of everything that is built and that we use, instead of thinking that it just sort of goes in a line and then winds up in the landfill and it kind of disappears. Instead, we have to think of what happens at the end of the use of that thing. And there are designs that take that into account. You know, the materials that are used are selected so that they're appropriate for the use, but then they can also be reused. And we need to do more of that kind of thinking. That's a circular economy.
Yeah, I've always been frustrated that we're taught like reduce, reuse, recycle, and it feels like society went right to recycle and forgot about reduce and reusing. And
Right.
What's the fourth one now? Reuse? Reduce, reuse, recycle, no. Anyhow, there's another fourth R, because the world's always changing. Can't stay the same as when I was in grade school, which is good. All right, so on to a next question. We've got one that came in from John. So like, what's the strategy that's most likely to be adopted in the next 10 to 15 years?
What's the most likely?
Yeah, to be adopted to help deal with these issues that you just outlined.
Well, I don't know if I know what needs to be done. I don't know if it's likely. That's the problem, right? Okay, what we need is a concerted policy effort globally, right? That we had that announcement in 2015 at the Paris Climate Accord, but now we need to actually put that into policy action that is applied at all the jurisdictions. We've got these plans that we had the Canadian plan, the Manitoba plan, and the Winnipeg plan. They now need to be actually implemented and beyond. All of those plans actually don't coincide with, aren't consistent with the IPCC 1.5 report that I showed you. None of them actually are really showing us a plan that involves like deliverables and budget that is consistent with what needs to be done to reduce our emissions to 50% of what they are right now by 2030. That's only 10 years away, less than 10 years away, half of what they are right now, and then to zero by 2050. So what I'm saying is, to address the question, is that's what needs to be done, is that policy direction that actually is consistent with the scale of work that needs to be done. Can you repeat the question just to make sure that I answered correctly?
I think you got it. John, if he didn't get it, send a follow-up question and we'll see if we can clarify. Yeah. So just can you outline any of the ideas that what really led to that upswing in the past 3 years in Manitoba? Just like, do you know what caused that?
Well, I've looked at the data for the sources of emissions. And in Manitoba, we've really got three key sources, sectors as sources of emission. We have transportation is the biggest one. Transportation, agriculture, and space heating. What they call it combustion, stationary combustion. So I looked at the sources, and all three of those have gone up during that period. And they, like in the year from 2017 to 2018, the last 2 years of reporting. So all three of them went up, but the one that went up the most was transportation. And Manitobans have consistently and still are buying big vehicles. There's been a real shift from single passenger automobiles, light duty gasoline is what they called, light duty gasoline to light duty trucks. So we're moving from cars to SUVs and half tons and vans, and those typically use more fuel per kilometer than the others do, and those vehicles have been the ones that have been the most popular, and there's been a significant shift in all those vehicles. Also, moving goods around, there's more heavy duty diesel emissions. That's been fairly flat. I haven't done all the analysis. It just came out last week, and so I haven't analyzed all of them. But so transportation has gone up for sure. Emissions from stationary combustion, from the natural gas we burn for our buildings, has also gone up. We had been actually achieving some considerable reductions over a number of years from residential buildings with some energy efficiency programs that had been implemented that actually achieved some improvements there over a number of years. But then even that's changed and started to go back up again. Part of it has to do with the number of homes that are being built, but also we still are building big homes. And big homes take more energy, even if they're built efficiently. And they aren't built efficiently, really, as compared to the passive house level of standard, where we don't have the building code doesn't require a level of energy efficiency that is really getting close to the passive house level. It's and most builders are really cost conscious, and they'll build to the code and no further, because the market doesn't really respond to it. We as homeowners aren't really aware of how wonderfully comfortable an efficient home can be. We look more for granite countertops than we do for energy efficiency, and we don't understand how comfortable those kinds of homes are. And then in agriculture, the use of anhydrous, the use of those synthetic fertilizers continues to grow. Farmers know that it's a high cost input, but they still get more yields. They're still getting more yields out of it. So the trend tends to still be there. As I said, I haven't analyzed the data really fully. It only came out a few days ago, but the trends seem to be in the wrong direction.
Yeah. Well, that graph definitely was going in the wrong direction from how I understand graphs. Yeah. So yeah, thanks for that rundown. I've heard that they're still building to like the same standards as like the 70s or something like that.
No,
is that true?
Not quite. No, not quite. No. The building standard actually in 2014, it did start to include energy efficiency as part of the standard. Prior to that, the standard was really focused more on safety and longevity, in terms of that it's not going to fall down on your head.
Right on.
Right. But then in 2014, they did come up with a building energy code, and there's definitely negotiations and everything there's a prospect at the federal level to enhance the energy code, but it'll be a while coming, and the approach they're taking is stepping it up in stages, and so far as I can see, the stages that it's asking for aren't as aggressive as what they need to be in order to achieve a reduction anywhere close to the kind of reductions we need to meet the IPCC 1.5 report.
Well, you've all heard it here. Energy efficient homes are comfortable. So Tell your friends.
Yep.
So our comment area isn't only for questions. The other two R's from our friends at the Green Action Center are rethink and refuse. So reduce, reuse, recycle, rethink, reuse. Those are your 4 R's. All right, so what can a high school student do to flatten the curve?
What can a high school student do to flatten the curve? Well, before I focus on high school students, can I, and you know, I just want to comment, because a lot of times people say, well, this is, you know, it's up to the young people to solve the problem. And I just want to say here now that it's not. It's up to all of us. We can't, you know, cause the problem and then expect young people to solve it. So that's my comment, first of all. And when it comes to all of us, including high school students, I think the first step is for us to take this seriously and personally. Now, when I say seriously and personally, like, and I've even done a change since I've become aware of Greta Thunberg, and because she, I just back up a little bit about her situation. She's from Sweden, and her parents are professionals. I think her mother is a concert cellist or something like that, and her father is a professional. But her mother was giving performances like in Japan and all over the place, and Greta told, like, how can you do this? What are you doing? You're traveling all, you know, we're talking about climate change and not putting greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, but yet here you are flying all over the world. How can you do that? And they've since changed, and they no longer do that. They don't fly. They take the train, which in Europe is electric, and etc. They've made their changes because of the realization that it's not something that we can change in the future. We've got to change it right now. And we have to keep this in mind, that if I jump in a car and I drive it and I burn a liter of gasoline, that liter will produce about 2.4 kilograms of carbon dioxide, or carbon dioxide equivalent, okay? And that 2.4 kilograms will stay in the atmosphere. 20% of it will still be in the atmosphere 300 years from now. Let that sink in. That's the thing. That's the reason why we've got to get on this problem now, because every bit of carbon we add to the atmosphere stays in the atmosphere for a long time. And as we're deforesting, as we're cutting down forests, and the oceans are no longer, like, even that, the ability for that carbon to be extracted, it's taking longer and longer. So long story short, round to what a high school student can do. You know, same as all of us. First of all, take it personally. Really decide, where does how much greenhouse gases are you putting into the atmosphere with everything that you do, and think about how you can change that, and how much you can do yourself, and how much you need help to do. I mean, obviously you can't change your home, but you can change how you move around. Like, if you, rather than shopping more often, shop less often. If you do buy something, buy it to last. Like, when you buy, don't chase the most recent fashion trends. You know, good, serviceable, attractive clothes that last for years, rather than something that changing it every season. And also, there's a lot of stuff you can get that you can get from the Goodwill or from Kijiji or from, other sources, rather than brand new from halfway around the world. So your consumer choices is what I'm getting at. Like, being conscious, being concerned, but then being conscious of the consequences of your choices, primarily when it comes to as a consumer and in transportation. If you can get to school by bike or walk, don't ask your parents to drive you. Use an alternative method of getting to school, or to your friend's place, or to hockey practice, or whatever you want. Take the bus instead of asking your parent. If you can get your hockey bag, if you're not a goalie, pretty difficult. But anyways, but it's just a matter of being conscious and doing what you can with your purchasing choices, your transportation choices. Those are the two ones that I would think that a high school student, and then also awareness with your fellow students, with other people that you know. Make sure that others realize that this is important to you, and that they don't just think it's fluff, or it's a problem for somebody else. It's instead of something that we all have to take seriously and address.
Yeah, there's a lot of things we can do as individuals, but we have to remember that the biggest emitters are big companies, and we need governments to make sure that they're regulated, right?
Well, yeah, policy, there, as I was saying, like take now I'm not focusing on high school students, but rather all of us, and take seriously all the source of emissions that we're responsible for. And as I said, we've got to build our resilience in food, shelter, transportation. And I'm suggesting that we all as individuals think about, where does our food come from? How efficient is our home or our offices? Everything that we use, can become concerned about that, and do what we can, and our transportation choices, just like high school students, adults make the same kinds of choices. But then make your choices and make your changes that you can. But anything that you feel as though you can't, but you need help with, policy help, like the bus is the bus, but it wouldn't be great if the bus was electric. Call your city councilor and say, I would like to ride on an electric bus. Talk to your MLA, because the province has a role to play in that as well. And elected officials need to understand the things that you can't change and you need help with. And that's what I think we all need to do. Take an inventory of, where does your food come, as much as possible buy local rather than from halfway around the world, and grow more of your own food. There's a lot of fun in it, a lot of satisfaction, and it also provides a certain amount of resilience for things like what we're in right now. I know that the seed catalogs are there. People are having a hard time getting seed for this year, and other people that I know are going to be gardening that didn't garden before, are going to give it a try this year. And that's a really good, self-reliance. What you can do to be self-reliant is important, both personally as well as for the planet.
All right, so super quickly, how long before a pilot project for the airships is? Super quick.
That's a good question. I talk to Barry Prentice fairly often about whether or not progress is being made, and he still needs, this is a good example of where policy support is required. I mean, the airport wasn't built by the airlines. The airport was built by public funds. There needs to be public support in order for airships to even get to the proving stage. It needs public input, public support. Now, in terms of the design, there is a design that is going to be available for the market. So we will be able to buy a fairly capable machine in the near future, like within the year, apparently. But we still need places to put it. So that's where the public support is required. Airports and hangars.
All right. Well, thank you, Curt. Thank you so much for all of the knowledge that you just shared today. Thank you to our audience for all of the great questions. So it's the same time, same place tomorrow. We're going to learn a little bit more about how to further decarbonize the economy so that we're putting less of that 20% of the emissions into the air for 300 years. And so reminder again about the strike on Friday. Tell your friends, tell your families, make sure that they have a plan for how they're going to show up and access. It's going to be on the radio, CKUW, UMFM, and on different streaming services. So make sure you turn into that to make some noise for the climate. And have a great day. Be nice to somebody. Say hello to somebody you haven't talked to in a while. And we'll see you here tomorrow. Bye, everybody.